launched by the Policy and Society Institute in cooperation with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. On this session is going to be on the Salafi trend, the Salafi phenomenon that everybody occupied its devotees, its competitors in light of the Islamic activism, and kept the entire world, governments and peoples concerned. Today's session is going to be interesting because it's going through the four panelists. We will try to shed several lights on this phenomenon in terms of the inception, its content, what it has achieved, and what it has lost in its several battles that it has waged. And we will stop by the findings of these battles and the conclusion of this phenomenon and how it will be and if it's going to have an influence on politics and on the level of the ideologies and the ideas. We will start with dear brother Muhammad Abruman, who's presented a painting, an important one, in his paper. He tried to control this phenomenon and have it in its general and specific context, its political, ideological context. So his paper was pretty interesting. And when I try to identify specific questions to discuss with Brother Muhammad, I found it really difficult to put pressure on myself and limit myself to a certain number of questions. But maybe the first question I would like to raise to Brother Muhammad is, despite of the differences that you mentioned in your paper between the different religious currents, including the Salafis, but it seems that the Salafi current is the deepest one. It represents the depth from which the political Islam takes its presence and is the main reservoir, even if there are diverse interventions in the Salafi currents in their broad sense. Can the Salafi current be the reservoir for political Islam? Thank you, Mr. Salah, and happy Eid, Adha Mubarak, everybody. This is a very relevant question because, from my opinion, in the Arab world, namely from the perspective of scholars, they, restrict the Salafi scene or landscape to some movements, to some harakat, and they deal with the Salafi currents as one package, one concrete package, and this is incorrect. And the second thing which you mentioned is that Salafism has historical extension and jurisprudence and ideology and religion, so they are not a new social movement. And this is what distinguishes between the Salafi currents and the Tahrir party or the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, because the Salafi current is based on the ideology, on the religious reference, more than the movements that are based on socio-economic and political challenges. So it is difficult to make the distinction, and this is the important point, Mr. Salah, that you pointed out. It is difficult to make a distinction between the Salafi heritage and the Sunni jurisprudence. So the Islamic movements take from the Sunni jurisprudence, and here is the overlap in the sophisticated manner that we see in dealing with the Salafi phenomenon. And since the Arab Spring, we have been following up the Salafi transformations. At the time, I was in Washington, D.C., I was writing the book Salafists and Arab Spring. There were schools of thought of American and Western scholars who went in depth into the study of the Salafi Islam and political Islam, but they were not aware, those think tanks. I'm even talking about Washington, D.C. at the time. They were not aware of these currents. There are some academics who studied the Salafi currents, Arabs and Westerners, but I'm talking about the political scholars and think tanks. So there was some crisis in dealing with the Salafi current. With the beginning of the Salafi current after the Arab Spring in its partisan flavor. At the time, we had the Noor Salafi party in Egypt, and it wasn't the only one, as Dr. Ahmed Shalata has books on this topic, and many of the colleagues from Egypt, they have books about this. There were other Salafi political parties in Egypt, but light has been shed on a Noor political party, and Salafists were like the surprise of the Arab Spring at the time. What I mentioned in my paper, and this is the bottom line, which might be discussed further in this seminar, is that Salafists were surprised, were taken by surprise in the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring was like an earthquake for the Salafi currents. And yes, colleague Sheikh Osama might argue in a while that Salafists are not totally new to politics. Abdurrahman Abdul Khaliq from Kuwait and Sudan and some other countries had other experiences, but Salafi current alienated itself from political action. Now they started establishing the Salafi parties in Egypt, and they try to reproduce this experience in Tunisia, as you know, Mr. Salah, as well as in Yemen and in other countries. Even in Jordan, there was some Salafi young people who wanted to form their political party, and I talked about a conference that was held in 2011 in Istanbul that involved Salafi leaders to discuss the Salafi position from political action. Some of them wanted to go to partisanship, and some of them wanted to form a lobby group and interest group. However, the Salafi transformation started with the Arab Spring. But the other transformation I try to focus on in the paper happened in 2013 when the reactions or the counter uh, revolution started moving in the other direction. And here the paradoxes started in the paper I presented between the uh, stalemate in their identity, and focusing on identity is not new. It goes back to Ahl al-Hadith, prophetic sayings, people, because they defended the people of Sunnah and Jama'ah, and the new Salafists try to maintain the purity of the Sunnah. And here we find the difference with the other political Islamic political movements. While they focus on identity, we found, and this is something Mr. Salah you mentioned in your introduction, we found some political pragmatism that was unexpected from many Salafi parties and currents, and this is related to the Sunni jurisprudence and heritage that had some perspective in dealing with the tyrant rulers, based on interest. But it is difficult to make a distinction between the Salafi movement and the jurisprudence and ideology, which is widespread in the Arab world. In 1 minute, can you answer a question that might be an introduction or an entry point to the other papers? The Salafi movement emerged. It surprised everybody. It mushroomed, but then it receded. It witnessed some backsliding. After all this rise, there was this landslide. So when Saudi Arabia, stopped supporting the Salafi, is this enough or adequate justification for this recession in the Salafi movement? No, this is not enough. We mentioned in the paper the importance of the transformation. Saudi Arabia supported and sponsored the Salafi movement, the Salafi ideology in its current formula, but for sure in Egypt, a Noor party that had 20% of the seats, and it ranked second in the 2011 elections. In the most recent elections, they collapsed. Their grassroots receded, and there were some cleavages, some defection in the grassroots support for a Noor party. Thank you, dear Dr. Muhammad. We will continue this discussion. Now we move to Hassan Abu Hania. He gave us the example, and this is a very relevant example, which is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria. And from this example, he tried to show some dynamics, some pragmatics that some Salafist groups show, despite of their rigid creed and strict creed, and because they stick to the Islamic constants. But there are some Salafi entities like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham that showed some pragmatic approach and try to get rid of some connections that might lead this hay'a or entity into a dilemma, like what happened with the other Salafi groups. Mr. Hassan, disconnecting the organizational relationships with Qaeda and ISIS or Daesh, especially with Qaeda, they disconnected their relations. Do you believe that this is a tactic that hasn't succeeded or relatively succeeded? Or do you believe that there are deep transformations inside the Hayat Tahrir Sham, which allow us to say that some Salafi groups can, disconnect with their back reference and make a paradigm shift in their strategic ideology and in their theoretical background? Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Salah. Thank you, everybody. Yes, this question, is this a strategic change or is it a tactic? And this is what, I didn't have enough time to clarify it in the paper, but I wanted to go back to the concept of Salafism because it is a jihadi movement, a Salafi movement. So Salafism is not well studied, as Muhammad said. It's not new. The first Pontin Courage, who wanted to study the Muslim Brotherhood, and I suggested to him to study Salafism in the 1990s. He asked, "What do you mean by Salafism?" I told him they will be big deal. So he thought there is political, jihadi, and pure Salafism, and what besides this is the context. So Henry Lozier, when he wrote his book Salafi Industry, so those who sets the concept of Salafism is the context, it's not the texts. So in considering Salafism, this involves, the Holy Quran and the prophetic sayings and the three first centuries, then Ahmed bin Hanbal, then Ibn Taymiyyah, reaching to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. We know that this Salafism has always been the product. And here we need to understand Hayat Tahrir Sham and the other Salafi movements. These are movements that interpret between the text, like the anthropology of Islam, the Al-Kitab and Sunnah, the Holy Quran and the prophetic sayings and the impact on humans. This is very important, as well as the interpretations, the what they decide on their discretion, because they all agree on God, the characteristics, what can happen, what can't. There is no disagreement on this. The disagreement is on the practical side, whether this person is a member of Hayat Tahrir Sham, jihadism, and purism. So does this text apply to this member? Is this person an infidel, a disbeliever, polytheism? We noticed that in the Syrian case, something weird happened. There was a consensus in the pure Salafism, the Albani Salafism, who are not involved in political or jihadist actions. And the traditional jihadi related to Qaeda, they all said we need to fight Al-Assad because he is Nusayri, he is sectarian, and he is murtad, and he is barbarian, and he is brutal. And we saw how this context reading is not only about text. So how they establish Salafi groups, Albani, Al-Asala and Tanmiya, and Jaish al-Islam, Islam Army, and then Ahrar al-Sham, and other movements. So the contexts in understanding Salafism were of paramount importance, and the interpretation of the texts, depends on the transformation. So Hayat Tahrir Sham, in their inception, in Hayat Tahrir Sham, which started as Nusra Front, they involved all these Salafi differences. Some of them were the extension of the ISIS. ISIS was the most radical in the jihadi movement, and Khorasan, a group related to Qaeda. And some of them are local jihadists who are linked to local jihadi movement, Marwan Hadid and the others. And there are other jihadists who are political, Madhar al-West and others. So it involves all those forms. So what's different about Hayat Tahrir Sham? They were different not in the interpretation of the text, and this is an apostate sectarian regime, but how to deal with this regime, how to deal with other movements, because we saw that Hayat Tahrir Sham always clashed with the ISIS, with Free Syrian Army factions, and they always say we rely on the texts. They accuse ISIS as being Khawarij, or they accuse the others as agents of the West, so on and so forth. So the contexts always dictate the interpretation of the situation. So whenever something new happens, they remodel, they reinterpret the text to apply to reality. So through a very long process, they define themselves as a Salafi movement committed to Kitab and Sunnah provisions and establishing religion. But when, for example, Russians are involved, they reinterpret this based on interest, jihadi perspective, and if Turkey gets involved, they do paraphrasing and they reinterpret the situation.
So this is what matters most. Salafi movement is a purely contextual movement par excellence. Even the most Puritan versions of Salafis, i.e. Madkhali Salafis, they also took to arms. And even the jihadist movements, they have no problem with switching to the other side. So it's context sensitive in this case. And the way they understand and interpret the context is of paramount importance. Going back to the roots with jurisprudence, you have the script and then you have the reality, and you project the script on reality or vice versa as per the incarnated interpretations and exegeses of the Sunni jurisprudence. So that's why we have to wonder what is the future of this form of Salafism, because we know all of these Islamic movements actually they become Salafized, quote unquote, because of Saudi Arabia's input. But of course, there is something related to the origins of Salafism, and that they were formed in order to hold the Sufism responsible for historic failure in standing up to colonialism during the colonial eras. So you have the jihadi Salafis, you have the national Salafis fighting colonialism in Morocco, Puritan Salafism, etc. So these are all multiple Salafisms and Salafi movements. So it's a hegemonic idea in the pan-Arab world. You do not find anyone contending or competing with that movement, be they Sufism or other versions of Islam. The entire Arab world has, including the state-based post-colonial ideology, is a Salafi Islam, even it falsely claims it's under the rubric of Sufism. I did not want to interrupt you. Thank you for that point. Because the most important idea that you focused in your paper, however, I would like to inquire and perhaps ask you to clarify that this interconnection at the subversive level between the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood, and you focused mainly on the Syrian experience, and that those responsible for creating the Syrian Salafi factions originated from the Brotherhood. So there is a kind of an underlying joint or common fabric, despite all the contradictions and the disparity amongst both later on. Now we move to the third paper of the day for the Arab revolutionary activism and Sufism. And Salafi, Salafi movement by Mr. Mubarak from Kuwait. I liked the paper, but I wanted to ask you about two key issues or points. You said that Salafism as a phenomenon is quite old, nothing new in Kuwait. And the other point, which is quite a contentious issue, and even in Tunisia is still trying to see how they are impacted by it, is the political specialization of work and the Dawah-based, the call to faith version. So I ask you under this rubric, how is the Kuwaiti experience of particular nature in this case? How is it a privately different experience and revamping Salafism in a new form and avoiding to become implicated in many of the issues that their sister movements became implicated? Thank you very much indeed. Eid Mubarak, of course, for the upcoming Adha Eid. And thank you very much, PSI, and as well as the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for this invitation. And this is my second invitation, actually, being with you. Your question is important. However, before addressing this particularity of the experience in Kuwait, I have to say something for me as a researcher in Islamic political work. And I was personally influenced of this phenomenon, of studying this phenomenon and what happened in Tunisia with the Nahda party which was actually my master's thesis, focusing on Nahda movement in Tunisia. That's why I'm already influenced by the other fellow researchers and authors in Tunisia and Morocco in the way I approach political Islam. And of course, I can fall back on the tools for comparative tools and analytical tools as well. However, back to the topic of the paper about the revolutionary activism and the Salafism issue in Kuwait. To make a long story short, I'll address 3 points. Perhaps they might answer your question. And before addressing those 3 points, I'd like to comment on what Muhammad Abu Rumman has just said. Is that the transformations with the Salafis took place after the Arab Spring activism in Kuwait. This is not true. The transformation started since the 1980s. And I did indicate this thing in my paper. So, what are the most important key pillars or themes that explain this particularity of the experience in Kuwait? One, there is a phase of Salafism as a counter movement or a counterweight. And this is actually what took place in Kuwait back in 1967 when the Salafi group has been established. Why has it been formed and established? One of their notable leaders, Sheikh Abdullah Sabt, rest in peace, of course. He said the Salafi movement is there to be a movement competing with other movements or groups like the Brotherhood and the Tabligh and Dawah movement. So the Salafi group has been established in Kuwait back in 1967 as an ideological or Dawah-based or counter-Dawah-based movement or as a rectifying, corrective movement back in 1967, i.e., it's not there as a movement to be politically opposing the regime. And I'm here using the term used by researcher Abdul Baqi al-Hirmasi when he explained the overall political Islam landscape in Tunisia. And he used this terminology, the oppositional Islam or protest-based Islam. So it's not there as a movement to protest anything or that is in direct opposition. And I would say that particularly this is the emergence of Sunni movements in Kuwait has been a fairly stable activism. Therefore, they're not underground and they're operating open in the public. And operating in public has never jeopardized or undermined their presence or activism. And this has actually facilitated their access to state finances and state resources, as one of the researchers has indicated. And also, this could perhaps explain why there is this proximity and affinity between the Salafi movement and the ruling regime. And those Sunni Islamic movements at the outset, they were originally supported by the political regime, unlike the situation in Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and other Arab states. So those are movements that were at the outset supported by the political regime in Kuwait. This issue, and as a matter of fact, has to be taken into consideration when we study the political Islam as a field or area in Kuwait. So it's as a counter movement. The second phase, Salafism not as a counter movement, but rather as a political movement. And probably this could clarify Abu Rumman's point. Salafi as a political movement. This is a phase which is a result of phase one as a counter movement, which was also multi-phase. First of all, the theoretical propositions by Sheikh Abdurrahman Khalid to have a specialized way of merging the da'wah-based with the political-based approaches, and as Mr. Al-Jurshi has indicated in his question. So he was calling for a merger, a streamlining, mainstreaming the da'wah faith-based path and the political action path. And there were disagreements therein. In this phase, particularly at the beginning of the 1980s, we can say that Salafism became a clear-cut political movement under the umbrella of the Association to Revive Islamic Heritage, established back in 1981. This phase is still ongoing, and I believe, in my own point of view, it has produced various divergent paths within the Salafi body, which is as I call it, quote unquote, the Salafi fission. What do you mean by the Salafi fission? Or the political Salafi fission and political mutiny or political dichotomy, for that matter, three different options. After the Salafi group, which is the political arm of the Association for the Revival of Islamic Heritage, was established in 1992, it has undergone different developments after the liberation of Kuwait back in 1991, after the Iraqi invasion. There was an internal protest movement within the Salafi body, actually representing many narratives rather than a monolithic narrative. The first one is the disagreement of soliciting the help of foreign forces. And the second narrative, or the second line of the story, as I must say, is that there is a Saudi Salafi impact on the Salafi movement in Kuwait, or as one researcher dubbed it, the Saudization of the Salafi ideology in Kuwait. And therefore, many protested against that. And the result was the very first division and fission, as I literally call it, organizationally speaking, Kuwait back in 1996, when the Salafi movement or the scholarly Salafi movement was established, which has laid the grounds for something of paramount importance, which is the increase of the number of Sunni Islamic movements in Kuwait after 1996. They mushroomed. Compared to the 1980s and 1970s, the Sunni Islamic movements, there are either two directions, either the Brotherhood or Salafi movement. As for Da'wah and Tabligh, this is something else that I will not attend to its details right now. As I said, please, in 1 minute, can you please summarize concisely? Okay, so this kind of development, this fissile development, has laid down the foundations for multiple Salafi paths and tracks. So in 2003, we had Thawabit al-Ummah group, and then the Ummah Party, Nation Party. And by the way, it's the party now that represents the Islamic political protest-inclined movement founded by Dr. Hakim al-Mtayri. Excuse me, or the dichotomy. So the dichotomous representation has actually resulted in an independent Salafi movement that is not an organized movement. And in relation to the Arab revolutions, activism is not as rigorous as the impact of the protest movements we've seen in Kuwait, especially in tandem with the Arab Spring. The protest-led movements in Kuwait had more impact in Kuwait rather than the Arab revolutionary activism. I'm not saying there was no impact whatsoever intrinsically or internally, but of course it was actually with a different ceiling, which is the reform of the political regime. And then we have the Jami faction. And I can be quoted here. I go on record by saying that this Jami faction within the Salafi movement has become quite vociferous, with a clear-cut discourse and also with social media websites and pages, and became quite influential, albeit limited. So my key observations here is that this dichotomous classification between fundamental and activism-based Salafism is no longer valid, because we had multiple movements, we had also opposition. It's no longer sufficing to describe the overall form of the movement in Kuwait. So we do have loyalists, and we have those in opposition as well. And as I mentioned, that its development preceded the Arab revolutionary activism. Thank you very much. From Kuwait, we move to Morocco. Morocco has a particularity here, which is quite interesting and attracts the attention, because two things of essence here I would like to allude to. There was a national Salafi movement in Morocco established that was there to oppose and fight colonialism, but with a democratic reform based, led by the notable figure Allal al-Fasi. And the reformist movements within Morocco were expecting that their regime would be depending on Dr. Abdul Hakim, ممكن can you mute yourself?
شويش في الصوت.
تسمعوني؟
Yes, we can hear you.
مشكلة في الصوت أستاذ صلاح، كأنه عندك صار صوتين.
صوتين، يمكن جزء أشخاص.
Yes, because actually two mics were on.
الآن صوت واحد.
Yes, you're fine now. Go ahead.
هذه هي الديمقراطية.
This is democracy, despotic democracy, one vote, one man, one vote. Anyways, so we say Morocco is a special case, simply because long time ago, we've seen a very special type of Salafism that is patriotic, national, that is prone to openness and modernity, and trying to fortify Morocco and the Islamic ideology from any setback against colonialism. And Allal al-Fasi is the most notable key figure in this national patriotic Salafi movement, and he is the founder of Al-Istiqlal/Independence Party in Morocco. And also we had a regime, the ruling regime was solely relying on the religious legitimacy, and he's in charge of the religious institution, and this would have been more than enough to stop or halt or obstruct the Salafi movement. However, given those two points I alluded to in Morocco, we do have Salafi activism and movement that has been translated into multiple Salafi organizations, and even Morocco was on the verge of becoming implicated in large-scale terrorist activities, had it not been for counter developments that really curbed and limited this all-out orientation towards a rigid, closed Salafism or version of Salafism and jihadi Salafism. And Muhammad Abdul Wahab Rafiqi, that's why he considers himself as a witness to this experience, simply because he has a very wide, on the larger scale, cultural knowledge of the particularities of his countries, and simply because he was immersed and involved in this Salafi faction, and he has been one of their key leaders and sheikhs, the Jihadi Salafis or the new Salafi movement in Morocco, and that's why his relations are paramount importance. And he tried to portray an accurate picture about the Salafi case in Morocco, albeit Muhammad Abdul Wahab is a very rare case in point where he moved from radical Salafism to an openness and ideological transformation that was so drastic and still ongoing with Muhammad Abdul Wahab in Morocco, and probably he might be surprising us with more daring attitudes than what has been expressed. Mr. Muhammad Abdul Wahab, the floor is yours.
ميوت دكتور محمد، ميوت انت.
You're on mute, Dr. Muhammad. Sorry. Hello, everybody.
زيادة سي صلاح.
Looks like Mr. Salah, encouraged you too much. Thank you, Salah. Thank you, PSI. Thank you, FES, for this invitation. It's great pleasure to be with friends. It's been a long time. I haven't met some of the colleagues face to face. The paper, as Mr. Salah mentioned, I try to give an overview of the Salafi movement in Morocco from the historical background, and the situation now. The summary of the paper, it starts talking about the history and the historical context, and part of this history was mentioned by Mr. Salah in his introduction. Honestly, National Salafism, to be accurate, National Salafism has nothing to do with modern or Wahhabi Salafism, only the name. I don't think that there are any common denominators between them. Maybe one common thing between them, which is fighting what is called in modern Salafism the apostate and praying for the graves and the shrines, but not, the national Salafism cites what a polytheism from a rational basis, not from a text argument, because it was more minded, more mental or mind oriented movement, and the other movements consider themselves as an extension of this national Salafism. But I believe that this is a failure attempt because the differences are based on the fundamentals of modern. Allah Al-Fasi may be the last person because he came late in who was one of the last ones who joined this but national movement, Abu Shuaib Dukkani, because he met Rashid Rida in Masr in Egypt, and he came back with some reform-minded ideologies, and the most prominent figure is Abu Al-Arabi Al-Alawi. That's why what I mentioned, quote unquote, Haraki Salafism, which is a new movement which made themselves an extension of Abu al-Arabi al-Alawi. Hamad al-Qabbas wrote a book about al-Arabi al-Alawi as if he says we are an extension of Abu al-Arabi al-Alawi. But in fact, there is a very big difference between them. Al-Arabi al-Alawi used to select the prophetic sayings from Sahih al-Bukhari, which is a taboo in modern Salafism. In the 1930s and the 1940s, he talked about a number of the prophetic sayings in al-Bukhari, and he considered them not very strong. And his daughters were not wearing hijab. And Al-Arabi Al-Alawi considered the bank interest as as not an interest or riba, and this is one of the issues that will make the regime, establish this a strong relationship with the leftists. If you go to Google, you will find a picture of Al-Arabi Al-Alawi. Despite of his reform-minded ideas, he was considered as Sheikh al-Islam. You will find a picture of him on the platform, and on the platform he has all the leftist leaders: Abdurrahman Yusfi, Al-Mahdi bin Barka, Abdurrahim Bou'bid, and all the leftist leaders. And he led the National Union for the Popular Forces, the most prominent leftist party at the time. So to be clear, this Salafism has nothing to do with the Wahhabi Salafism or modern Salafism. They only have the word Salafism in common. Going back to what the doctor said, Salafism, Wahhabi Salafism was supported by the regime, opposite to what the case in Tunisia, Algeria, or Morocco, and this is not accurate. On the contrary, having Wahhabi Salafism in Morocco did not come in an arbitrary way. Maybe if it was a neighboring country, they would have Salafism tied because of their proximity. But Morocco has a sophist dimension in Morocco. During Abdul Wahab himself and Sulaiman al-Alawi, they tried to bring Wahhabi Salafism to Morocco and they failed because the Sufi element was very strong in Morocco. But the decision to bring Salafism to Wahhabism in Morocco, this was a decision made by the state. The state decided to bring the Wahhabi Salafism to counter the left because the left has penetrated the faculties and the universities, and they decided to bring Wahhabi Salafism and to provide them with all the resources that will help them to frame and recruit the community. Al-Alawi, the Minister of Islamic Waqf during Hassan al-Thani II, he made a declaration in a newspaper that he received instructions to prevent him from interfering in the big mosques of the kingdom that were handed to the Salafi current. All the big mosques were mostly predominated by the Wahhabi Salafists, let alone the financial resources, the Quran schools that were in hundreds. And Dr. Abdul Hakim Abu Luz has a very big study about this. And this was a decision made by the state, and this was supported by the state. And to cut it short, why did I eventually say that Salafism in Morocco is weaker and weaker? Because this political agenda has changed. There is no more opposition leftists. They got involved in the state. There is no political agenda that prompts the regime to support the Salafism. So they narrowed down the space for them in order to acquit themselves from the accusation of supporting the Salafist currents that fuel the radical thought according to the political accusation that was promoted post 2001. So Morocco started to narrow down the space for them. So they shut down all those religious schools called Dur al-Quran, and even they went further, what is called Haraki Salafism, which I call Haraki Salafism, and I'm a bit hesitant about this name because this is a defection from Al-Maghrawi movement. When this new current tried to express in different ways their good rapport with the regime and their loyalty to the regime, their defense of the Muslim Emirates and their engagement in the state project, and even the religious schools, they, do the Warsh reading, not Hafs reading, because they think that Hafs came from the Orient. They teach the Maliki school of thought. So the new Haraki Salafism tried to harmonize between the Ash'ariyya and the Salafi creed. And we were raised in Salafism that Ash'ari is a misled sect and that they are misled people. Sometimes they are considered as infidels. This Salafism tried to, try to say that they came from the same origin and that this difference is not harmful in order to be in line with the creed of the state. Despite of all of this, when Hamad al-Khabbaz nominated himself or ran for parliamentary elections in 2016, the government rejected his candidacy and justified this because this person, expressed extremist ideology and encouraged extremism, and they prevented him from running for office. So this is a political issue. One last point with what I mentioned in the paper in 1 minute. I'm almost done. That Salafi jihadism has come to an end in Morocco. We don't have Salafi jihadism in Morocco anymore. The Salafi jihadism is only the sleeper cells that the Moroccan security arrests them from time to time, which is jihadism migration during ISIS, and now they move to Libya or to the coastal area. We don't have jihadi narrative in Morocco. Jihadi Salafism has retreated, and the Haraki Salafism, this current that defected from Maghrawi are active in charitable and philanthropy and relief work, and they do some media and Asabil newspaper and the others. Thank you. Thank you so much. I couldn't stop you, because the Moroccan situation is really interesting, and presenting this Moroccan case will enrich our discussion of Salafism. We still have an hour and 10 minutes, and in the time left for us, we will try to deepen our discussion on a number of issues. I ask for help. I ask for rescue in order to, organize the speakers, because there are many people who ask for the floor. Some people ask for the floor by typing their name in the chat box, and some people raise their Zoom hand or physical hand on the screen. So please help me with the list of people who would like to ask, so I can start, organizing things. There is Abdurrahman Al-Hajj asked for the floor, Dr. Amal, Dr. Sari, Dr. Hisham, and Dr. Hiba. Those are the people who asked for the floor. Dr. Abdul Hakim as well.
في حد آخر؟
Anybody else?
هذا إلى الآن.
طيب إذا باش نعطي لكل واحد 3 دقائق.
So we give each of you 3 minutes.
إلا النساء نعطيهم
Except women, we give them 1 or 2 more minutes just to empathize with them and to establish gender equality. Abdul Hajj, give us 5 minutes, Mr. Salah. Give us 5 minutes. 3 minutes are not enough. Go ahead. It's been a long time since we last saw you. Thank you. I will use the time to comment on 2 points. Regarding what Mr. Hassan mentioned regarding the Salafi transformations, and to look at these transformations in the context, I have an issue in the perspective of these transformations. In what Mr. Hassan Abu Haniya said, we see that transformations as internal transformations to maintain Salafism, i.e., the Salafism going in a certain context while they maintain their general shape. What we have been seeing in Syria is different. What happened in Syria is that the theoretical framework in Syria, even if we define it procedurally, what we can define as Salafism has been broken. Hayat Tahrir Sham undergone some transformations which made them no longer Salafism in any definition you have. So HTS came through different orientations and transformations, then they went out of the Islamic movement at all. So when we talk about transformations, Salafist movements, although they were rigid with very limited interventions because they are based on creed and ideology, and this is my perspective, maybe some of you might agree with me, the main makeup of the jihadi Salafism movements, this is based on the context, political and economic contexts, to put it shortly. Whenever there are certain transformations that lead to organizations that take more protest-oriented language more than a Salafi language, without a classical Salafism, which is a reservoir for the common Salafism that we know, this context will be closer to the religious protest movements, whether we have Salafism or without Salafism. And this explains, if we take the Kuwaiti example, which stresses this theory. In Kuwait, the Salafism and how it evolved, as we heard, of course, and here we're trying to tread in an unfamiliar territory. This is very far from transformation, whether this has been explained as a counter movement or a movement that has developed a pro-state position. This might not be, appropriate for those movements, but going for violence based on inappropriate political atmosphere might lead to these transformations. So what I want to say is that what we see from Salafism, Syrian Salafism, and we take the current example, which Mr. Hassan mentioned, HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, it's a transformation that violates Salafism itself if we try to define Salafism without a specific definition. I don't wish to take too much of your time. Maybe later on in the discussion we can elaborate more. Mr. Abdurrahman, to get you right, you are saying that the transformation within Salafism has a ceiling. If we talk about a deep transformation, it will violate the Salafi ideology and will, deviate from the Salafi ideology. Yeah, I mean, the transformations Hassan mentioned maintain Salafism, but Salafism is deviating. I mean, the transformations are deviating from the Salafi ideology. Amal, thank you so much for all the speakers for enriching these papers. I have a number of remarks and questions at the same time to gain some time. I have. Uh, in all papers, you mention the word moderation, and I wanted to see more elaboration in this concept. What do you mean by moderation? Has it witnessed transformations or has it maintained its nucleus that it had before? And this is a question to all panelists. The second aspect, which is reading the history of the Salafi movements and groups, it looks at this history from the perspective of the leaders, Su'ama and Sheikhs, whereas it is important to look at the sidelines, i.e., the Tirhal moving from one Salafism to another, uh, you know, being a nomad, moving from one Salafism to another. Why would one defect and establish their different vision in terms of Salafism? There is also competition. How do we see the impact of competition and its repercussions? And then repositioning the positionality. How do we reposition ourselves vis-a-vis these incidents? Is it based on the lobbying imposed on these movements or looking for a recognition and legitimization of their movements and actions? I conclude with Dr. Abu Hania. I liked, the contextual reading approach, but don't you think that we can add to it the sociological concept of the actors, i.e., how the actors move around and how they see reality, what's their reference, what's their behavior, their reaction, how they adapt to the incidents, the regime, the relationships, the coalitions, the authority, the power, and ownership of power. Because the text and the context no more try to change reality as much as reality is pulling these Salafi movements and forcing them to acclimate and adapt according to the geopolitical context, or if you like to call it, the socio-economic political context. So I believe that we need to follow the actor, the new player, and the new actor, the Russians, the Turks, the Saudis, so on and so forth. So in this sociological approach, we can provide a deeper benefit and knowledge about this contextual reading. Thank you. There are so many remarks and I have a lot of feedback, but I will stop here to respect time.
الصديق العزيز ساري
Now I give the floor to our dear friend Sari, albeit we are quite at a distance, but glad to meet. Thank you very much indeed for this great seminar and for the valuable interventions. Amal made my task easier by voicing some of our concerns and observations, specifically those pertaining to Hassan's paper. Because the political approach and the contextual approach that I'm always a proponent of has to pay attention to the intrinsic interactions therein. So in this discourse, even as we go about analyzing it contextually, we have to pay attention to the other nuances, because the examples that you provided contextually, yes, it is true that they do take into consideration the contextual differences and nuances, but there is still something at core of Salafism that would never change, even with the change of the context. And let me be precise about it. Probably I could cite an example here. I studied the curricula applied at the University of Kuwait. The Sharia-based political sciences, one of the courses that was taught like 3 years ago, I don't know whether or not it was changed, is par excellence, and in the full sense of the word, is the theoretical framework of what this ISIS has done in Mosul and Raqqa, is to ban based on jurisprudence of forming political parties and rendering apostates and renegades other movements. So I was shocked to see this curriculum, the Sharia policy, being taught as such in Kuwait. So it's important as we go about studying and analyzing the context to pay attention simultaneously to the formulation of the discourse. Second point out of my 3 quick points. I've been paying more attention on Salafi movement in France recently, because unlike and contrary to what the French regime is saying that it's a violent movement, actually there is no single indicator to tell that Salafi movement in France is violent. No one left their mosques to go to join the jihadi movements abroad. But why France is saying this? Simply because it's a democratic country and they have no previous despotic context. It's a social agenda. It's an agenda that's being rolled out to isolate French Muslims from their surroundings, from their communities. That's why it's of paramount importance in this regard, not to overindulge in political analysis, but rather we should focus more on social analysis of the Salafi conduct or behavior and whether or not it's developing as should be or not in this place or another. The third and last point in this regard, I am quite happy that this overall line of thought in this conference, and this is probably our 3rd seminar, they're not asking whether or not they should be engaged in politics or not. Religion as morals is permeating through all human areas, be it politics. Religion could moralize, render ethical politics, economics, and social relations. That's why in Salafi movement, I say that in my readings of their work, they very rarely focus on the moral, ethical dilemmas. They jump to conclusion to focusing on jurisprudence, fiqh. And like the late Sheikh Nasruddin al-Albani, in his scholarly lessons, he never focuses on the moral ethical dilemma, but he only focuses on the prophetic tradition of the hadith and renders or passes the jurisprudent ruling, and so on and so forth. So what is of paramount importance here is that the Salafi movement, when compared to the Brotherhood and their offsprings, is that they are still pretty much occupied with those issues, preoccupied with those issues, and still we on our side, we need to work a lot to understand what's their political input, because they took the morals, the overall guiding morals to serve the objectives of Sharia. Those should be projected on the Sharia-based jurisprudence for economics, politics, and sociology. If you can spare another minute, I'd like to say I'm also very important in the Al-Hassani Hadith Forum, especially my colleague who presented the Moroccan case. I read about it. In my interviews I conducted, I found it interesting that late King Hassan II established the Dar al-Hadith al-Hassaniyya because he was afraid that the Salafis hijacked the prophetic Hadith field of study. So he wanted to render a Moroccan version against the Albani or Wahhabi Salafism. Thank you. Thank you indeed. Now I'll give the floor to Ms. Hiba. Thank you very much indeed. The papers covered a large landscape, and probably this could be worthy of following up. Salafism as a phenomenon is quite a complicated and compounded issue. Anyone can have claim a certain reference and claim to be Salafi. You don't have the clear-cut judgments and rulings that are more present in other organizational movements. So there is a great fluidity in this so-called movement. As of 2011, when I was young, I used to attend the Salafi studies because the Brotherhood do not teach Aqidah or creed. So I was like shopping around in order to learn from all those moments. I never saw myself that I should be an adamant follower of one single school of thought. This was in the early 1980s when Jihadi Salafi started to have like strongholds and in the Egyptian university campuses. So this is quite a complicated issue, and probably the study from Kuwait would remind us, and probably another signal in Dr. Muhammad Abu Rahman's paper about various countries, including Yemen, is that about the relationship between Salafism and the tribe. And in Egypt, where the tribal structure is not that present, but of course the relationship with the countryside population, when the late Hussam Tamam talked about the Salafization and the countrysideization, quote unquote, if possible, of the Brotherhood. There are certain manifestations that vary from one moment to another, and some people hence could be accused of being opportunistic or pragmatic or ready to switch over. But this is quite a human. There are always radical transformations. Sometimes transformation is at a movement level, and sometimes it's waves of changes and transformations. Also, we have generations. We have certain generations who do not appear on the satellite channels, but rather you find them on Salafi channels, YouTube. Sheikh Abu Ishaq al-Huwaini has never been hosted in any serious show about those issues, but we do have other guests, like they are the media face of the Salafis who talks about the problematic issues of consent about women to non-Muslims. And also we have other different generations at the level of politics, and with different organizations in Egypt. In the Egyptian case, it differs by governorate. Those Salafis in the north are different from the Salafis in the south. So my suggestion is, why don't people pool their work as a workshop to pool the work of all those who worked on Salafi phenomenon, and then to consolidate their writings and to come out with a classification to see the different classifications. Because what we've seen on Facebook and social media, what I call the shabiha of the Salafis, who are go unchecked, undeterred, who are, the thugs, who are bullying around everyone. Because I often asked X, Y, and Z, who is their sheikh they report to? We can, because we can talk to him to admonish them. They say, no, they have no sheikhs to follow. So how come they are rampaging around the social websites without any deterrence? So it's an issue of fluidity. And the landscape in Salafism is just like the landscape of Brotherhood and other religious organizations or waves that come pass and go. It's not an independent scenery. And as Dr. Amal said about the actors, I would go for the agency, the intrinsic idea of being an actor. That's how, hence it's called agency. And it depends on their affiliations, geographical affiliations, and also their bigotry based approach. And that's why to compare and contrast the cases with could help us to come up with a more versatile classification, could be more useful. The case that was mentioned en passant without being given due attention by virtue of my recent readings is the Libyan case, because you have this Madkhali Salafi that has been transformed into paramilitary militias to support Haftar, who has nothing to do with the religious discourse. So they became a killing tool in the hands of the military power represented by Haftar, irrespective of whether or not we're with him or against him. He's a warlord, this general, and he is employing the use of Salafi groups and factions in the killings. And if we take stock of those nuances and we take into consideration the various cases and those who work on those pieces of research, if they pool and consolidate their work, we could have something rigorous. But this is the issue. In the Arab world, we don't have this co-authorship. We don't pool resources, unfortunately. It's only one person doing the authoring. But if 4 or 5 sit together and work hard on the drafting and the phrasing, this could be something robust and rigorous. Thank you very much. Dr. Abdel Hakim. Please, the floor is yours, but you're muted. Dr. Abdel Hakim, you're muted. You're muted يا دكتور عبد الحكيم.
واضح ان انت الاستاذ صلاح تجاوزتني في الترتيب، فاذا كنت انا بعد عبد
You
الحكيم.
skipped me. It's my turn. Yes, I take that back. Well, Abdel Hakim has already started. Abdel Hakim, please, we have to stop you. I'm psychologically in the mood. No, please.
لا 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 الدكتور عبد الحكيم يتفضل وانا
It's okay. Dr. Abdel Hakim, then I'll go after. Osama says, go ahead. Thank you, all the panelists who have really enriched us with what we've read. The 3 intervention have focused on a sociological approach to Salafi movements in a generic way. Overall trends, political trends. But I wonder, isn't it high time for researchers to go into more details rather than to stay at the global universal level, particularly cases in the Middle East, the Omani case, Mr. Abu Rumman and Mr. Abu Haniya? I ask you, isn't it high time to go and focus more in detail at a localized fashion on those movements? Probably would be able to learn more in depth about their leaders when it comes to polarization and recruitment. And this is scholarly based recruitment and polarization, especially in Morocco, prior to the 2003 and 2016 bombings. It wasn't quite an issue. The second question is that The classification thus far is that it's a conventional classical discourse followed by the activism-based, followed by the jihadi discourse. But there are also sub-factions, and the classical is not classical par excellence. It's classical, yes, but it could be more pragmatic to look for political affiliations and alliances to find an end to its plight. And so we're coming closer to the notion of the sect, to use Brian Wilson's word. These are religious movements that are working within society through guiding the faithful. But once they have problems, they become a sect and they leave the immediate vicinity to look for alliances that would render them capable of ridding themselves of their own crises. And the conventional classical Salafi movement or faction in Morocco, when their premises were shut down, they looked for alternative alliances and managed to regain some of its own activism and even some premises. So there are internal diversification in each faction or movement that should be taken into consideration, particularly with what Abu Aniya said, the contextual approach. I correct an idea for Mr. Rafiqi. The Salafi movement or faction in Morocco is no longer non-existent, but in 2016 he entered into alliance with Al-Asala party, and that's why the Maghrawi faction was able to re-emerge after their headquarters in Marrakesh was reopened, and now the classical conventional Salafi movement is already operating the way they used to be in the past. And I also correct you, sir, by asking the following. If the jihadi Salafi movement has disappeared in Morocco, as you claim, so why all of a sudden, every now and then as well, the state announces that it has dismantled certain jihadi factions or currents or groups? So this is the biggest evidence that the Salafi political groups are no longer non-existent, but rather they rejuvenate every time. Thank you. Apologies up front to Mr. Hisham. Please, the floor is yours. Floor is yours. Thank you very much. Eid Mubarak, inshallah. Well, how did I read those papers? 2 points. One, Salafi factions actually are practicing and doing politics in its modern form. So they have certain agenda. They do have a political. If they strike a balance with the brotherhood and other faction, this is politics. This has been the case with the Arab Spring, with the exclusion of Kuwait case. They have also joined the partisan landscape. But did they remain as Salafi movements? Do they still have the Salafi faith or the Salafi propagation, and to become pragmatic and to normalize its ties and connections with real politique, quote unquote? So these are ramifications that should be considered. However, what is of concern to me and more interest is the question related to their impact on the Arab Spring crisis or the post-Arab Spring crisis, because two issues. So they became partisan and they resorted to violence or the employment of violence, as you've indicated. And hence the question of its relationship and impact with the Arab Spring and the impact thereon is the question to answer for the future, as well as the question related to the backing off by the Saudis from supporting the Salafi movements overall. With regards to its relationship with and impact on the Arab Spring, we have to consider its attitude and position vis-a-vis freedoms and democracy and the obedience to the leader of the faithful, i.e. the president or the king, whatever, and also be it in the form of revolution and activisms. This is or you call it what you want. The third point related to the Arab Spring is the transformation from the identity-based agenda. You have to mute the other mic, by the way. That's why you hear the echo. The third point is related to whether or not the identity-based agenda. Please, Dr. Abdul Hakim, you have to be on mute.
عم بيصير في عنده صدى فانا عم بحمله ميوت فبعد اذنك دكتور عبد ضلك ميوتد.
Dr. Abdul Hakim. Yes.
النقطة الثالثة هي متعلقة بمسألة الموقف من خطط المعاش.
And the third point is related to the socio-economic agenda among the Arab citizens. And the fourth or fifth point, I lost count, is related to what we can call the core of the socio-economic platform. Does it support new liberal policies or not? And finally, it has to do with violence and the use of violence, because this is one of the issues that present what we can call the impact of these movements on the Arab Spring narrative related to these 4 or 5 points. Thank you, Mr. Hisham. Now, Mr. Osama, there is Sheikh Osama. Sheikh Osama, go ahead. Peace be upon you. Thank you for this seminar. Can you hear me, everybody? Yes, we can hear you clear and loud. Good. I have been a Salafist for 40 years, but today I have heard about Salafism that I have never heard of before. Many of you talked about imaginary Salafism. It does not exist. You remind me of what Aristotle said when he thought that women have more teeth than men, and he was married to several wives. He had several wives, but he didn't know how many teeth they have to see whether they are equal or not. You know, although those are specialist scholars, but maybe the reason behind this is that the political science they dominates them, and they want to formulate Salafism in the academic concept, like the person who talked about the sect and some, you know, academic descriptions that might come from a Western European approach, and they want to apply it to the Salafism. To give you some examples, for example, you say that the only exception is the Kuwaiti case, that the Kuwaiti case had political action before the Arab Spring, and this is a big mistake. Bahrain, for example, the Salafi, the Parliamentary Salafi action has been there before the Arab Spring, 20 years. And the deputy speaker was Al-Muawda, who is the Salafi head of the authenticity bloc and association in the Bahraini parliament. In Sudan, for more than 25 years, they have been talking about political action, and Salafists through the Sunni al-Muhammadiyya devotees, you know, they were governors, they were ministers, and even during the Ismail al-Azhari independence era, one of the 4 in the mandate over Sudan was a Salafist at the time. So unfortunately, these are some of the mistakes. Another mistake is that we need foreign academics to determine the Salafi divisions. You talk about jihadi Salafism, traditional, and Haraki Salafism. Albani, who is categorized as traditional or Mudkhali or Puritan, he thought that there should be in-kind jihad in Afghanistan, and Haraki al-Hawali, Saf al-Hawali, you know, counter this argument. Uh, now, Al-Harakiya, the Harakiya case, they have Khaliq and Muhammad Sroor, they have them in the same approach. But Muhammad Sroor thought that democracy was infidel and parliaments were infidel and the entire system was infidel. But Abdul Khaliq thought otherwise. And seeking the help of the Americans during the Gulf crisis, Abdul Khaliq supported this approach. So these designations are not the right designations, are not the appropriate ones. Unfortunately, these designations and descriptions come from the fact that there is, not full understanding, and maybe you don't mingle with Salafists. In Rafiqi's paper, page 1, brother Rafiqi was a Salafist, supposedly, and he's saying that politics involves leaving politics, and he has a YouTube link. I thought I should go to the YouTube link to see his evidence. So he has a YouTube link to Shaykh al-Albani, and the title says politics means leaving politics. If you hear that video, Albani says politics is a must, but now we should leave politics for the time being. And this is a political position, Albani. And his speech, he says that politics today involves leaving politics. So this is a political position. It's not a Sharia position. This is when Ba'ath Party controlled Syria. Albani in the 1950s was a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood in elections, and he nominated Zuhair al-Shawish and others. When Al-Ba'ath seized the power in Syria, he said that politics now dictates us to leave politics, because if I'm in politics, I will be arrested, I will be killed, so on and so forth. I don't wish to take so much of your time, but Salafism, there is misunderstanding in understanding Salafism. Please mingle with Salafists. Salafists are all around you in your countries. In Morocco, for example, that it's based on Malikiya, Ashariya, and Sufiya school of thought. And this is wrong. Morocco became Ashari after the year 500, after Hijrah, after the massacres. Morocco has always been Maliki and Salafi. Muqaddimat Ibn Khaldun, they are all about Salafism. So why are you trying to mislead history? Sulaiman and Alawites were the kings of Morocco. So there are some mistakes. I don't know the goal of them. Why are you talking about this? Now the context, the issue of the context, and this is very distant from understanding Islam and Salafism. Islam as Islam, any principle in the world would take into consideration the circumstances and the context. When Prophet Muhammad was very weak in Mecca, he was not instructed to do jihad. So I believe the context is there. It applies to all contexts, to all schools of thoughts. But the Salafi currents that are peaceful are criticized, and those who responded to the revolution in Syria when the regime rejected the non-violent solutions, so those currents were rejected, and I don't consider HTS as Salafists, and all the violent people are not Salafists. I have a book on Egyptian groups. They have never been Salafists. They don't have a Salafi reference at all. They have completely different references, and this is not our topic today. One of you talked about Salafists in the Arab Spring. Either they caused violence or they went for politics. But there's another part, which is the biggest part of the Salafism, who rejected the Arab Spring. The traditional or Puritan Salafism, they rejected the Arab Spring approach because it will cause, crises and problems for the people. Another comment on Hizb Nur, a Nur party, that it surprised everybody and it entered politics and became pragmatics. If they are ISIS, they are rejected and denounced. If they are pragmatic, they are denied, or not recognized. So, what do you want exactly? One last request. Please get in touch with Salafists. Sit with us. Listen to us. Don't hear about us, especially Western studies. They are full of mistakes about Salafists. Thank you, Sheikh Osama. We met before and we talked a bit in one of the visits in Amman. And please allow me to make a joke with you. I thought that after what happened throughout the years, I would find you in a different position, in a completely different position. Why? Because I'm based in Tunisia, and Tunisia was a country with positive benchmarks. When the Salafi current rose, I had a lot of concerns, and my concerns were right because the role Salafists played was very serious, maybe in good faith, maybe based on foreign funding, but they mixed up the political and religious scene in Tunisia, and the Nahda movement tried to accommodate them. They succeeded to accommodate part of a Nahda party, and they presented a completely different discourse, different from the democratic elites in Tunisia. So the Salafi balance in Tunisia was almost zero, i.e., their disadvantages were more than their advantages. I never found any positive point they did, whether they got involved in the jihadism, in Salafi jihadism, or maybe the scholarly Salafism. And what happened in Tunisia maybe happened in other countries. So I believe that after 9 or 10 years of what happened since the Arab Spring, you know, maybe there should be some drastic reconsideration of the Salafi perspective in general and the role Salafists have played in our region, unfortunately. And I will give you the floor back, but after we hear from the panelists who
الست دكتورة هبة طلبت أظن الكلمة.
Salah, Dr. Hiba asked for the floor. Yes, I will give her the final word. I'm sorry I interfered, but I thought you didn't see her. No, I wanted to give her the floor. Hiba, the floor is yours. I just noticed there is a mix-up between the authentic reference, the Salaf scholars, and Salaf as a movement. So we need to make a distinction. We use different tools for the study. This doesn't mean that we are Westerners or we follow the Western scholars, but there are distinctions. And the second thing is to look into the movement. They use the word ummah in its broad sense, and those have been, exploited by the regimes. So sometimes they opt for mistaken options, and showing these issues show the difference between the different movements. So if we focus not only on the position from political parties, but their position from women and citizenship, they redefine these terms in a certain way, but this highlights how there are differences or rapprochement. And the last point is that Salafism is logic. So in the Islamic awakening, especially in the Muslim Brotherhood in the Egyptian case, which I am close to from the extreme right to the extreme left, on women issues and the minorities, the Muslim Brotherhood were too much Salafists because they were addressing the community and they were trying to appeal to the community because they wanted to get the votes, because their positions in the closed rooms were different from what they say in the elections. Thank you. Dr. Salah, I'm sorry to interfere, but I just want to remind you that we still have 10 minutes only. 10 minutes only.
أنا عندي ثقة في السادة المتدخلين.
I trust the panelists. I will give each 1 minute and a half,
أو برا سيدي سأكون معناها
or I might be too generous and give you 2 minutes each. But please focus on one or a couple of points on what you heard from the different interventions and questions. And we start with Dr. Muhammad. Thank you, Mr. Salah. I apologize for interfering at certain points I thought you didn't notice. Hiba, I want to give very important remarks, very important information, and very methodological remarks. The most important thing we asked, it's a matter of revisiting. We revisit this theme to look into and analyze what has happened in the recent years. And this is what we try to analyze the Salafi behavior and what happened in the recent years. There are questions. I want to leave you with questions rather than with a conclusion. The question you raised, Salah and Muhammad Rafiqi discussed in his paper, why we transformed from national Salafism in its reasonable approach, not only in Morocco, but also in Sham. Abdurrahman talked about Al-Jamiyya al-Gharra, reform-minded Salafism, and even reform-minded Salafism in Algeria, and then they moved to a completely different approach. This is a very important question in the second half of the 20th century. And the second question was raised by Dr. Rafiqi, opposed by Hassan. But I believe that this is an issue we need to think of in the coming phase. Recently, there is the Salafi culture in the Arab culture. There is the not only the Muslim Brotherhood, but also others became Salafists. There are national and regional approaches to go counter Salafism. Hassan considered Salafism as the fate of the Arab communities. But can we talk about cultural transformations in the Arab world that detach itself from Salafism, just like it, was intertwined with Salafism at a certain point? Dr. Hiba and Abdul Hakim also talked about the new Salafi generation, the YouTube generation in Egypt. When the revolution started, they had the Costa Salafism. If you remember, the Salafi youth who were in the West and in the United States. So, as a sociological study, we need to study them. In my paper, Dr. Abdul Hakim, I focused on the sect because the sect was confused with the identity. The identity is central in Salafism. The sectarian aspect was important in what Hassan mentioned and how they criticize Salafism. Whenever there is Salafi sectarianism, there are no borders between the Salafi approaches. As if we have one Salafism, it's difficult to make a distinction between the different approaches. Mr. Osama, sects are everywhere. We talk about it from the context, not from the core. As Osama asked the researchers to mingle with Salafism, I reiterate Salahuddin Georgi's remark, and I asked Salafism to stop behaving as they have been done in justice and look into analyzing the different variants and look into the matter away from the perspective that it is the single perspective you look from Osama. All the researchers looked at the cause from different perspective, and you also in the Salafi movement you need to look at it from different perspectives. Muhammad Abdul Wahab, my friend, in 1 minute and a half, no, 2 minutes at least. I want to comment quickly on what the gentleman mentioned, what brother talked about Dar al-Hadith al-Hassaniya. I disagree with him. Dar al-Hadith al-Hassaniya came based on the coalition between the regime and the Muslim Brotherhood to fight the leftists. I didn't address this, which is a very long topic, because the regime build alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood before they moved to Salafism. The first coalition that the regime held in the 1960s was with the Muslim Brotherhood, and Dar al-Hadith al-Hassaniyya was a Muslim Brotherhood idea, and the owner is Bahauddin al-Amiri. He suggested Bahauddin al-Amiri, the well-known poet and the leader in the Muslim Brotherhood. He suggested to Al-Hassan II to establish the prophetic saying Dar al-Hadith al-Hassaniyya, and the leadership was given to Dr. Farouk al-Nabhan, who is a descendant of the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Syria. So Dar al-Hadith al-Hassaniyya, in addition to al-Hassaniyya lessons that were presented and sponsored by King Al-Hassan II. It's a Muslim Brotherhood based, and the one who started these lessons are Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, and the second one was Muhammad al-Sawaf. So Dar al-Hadith al-Hassaniyya and al-Hassaniyya lessons were based on the approach King Al-Hassan followed to fight the leftist approach at the time.
Of course, I can never agree more with Dr. Hiba's suggestion to pool and consolidate our work in order to network our work on these phenomena across the countries. Multiple factions inside the currency, of course. This is not exclusive to Salafism. But if we consider every faction, every current on its own, yes, we will have multiple diversified versions within each faction and sub-faction, with number of schools of thought, number of positions and attitudes that are context sensitive. What Abdul Hakim has mentioned with regards to the classical conventional faction being still there and Maghrawi's alliance with Asala party, yes, I do know that they went into alliance 2016, but personally, I do not believe that that alliance was quite important in terms of the outcome. The old guards, after the dichotomy and also the division involving Hamad al-Qabboush and others, were not able to render the projected impact on the election results. Even the many madrasas to teach the Noble Quran were reopened, but to no avail. Still, please, give me one more minute. I didn't say that the jihadi Salafi thought as an ideology disappeared, but I say its manifestations, visible manifestations, are no longer there in Morocco. You don't have key sheikhs, you don't have key factions, you don't have their jihadi Salafi mosques or strongholds. The ideology is still there. Hence, we can account for the terrorist cells that are discovered every now and then, but their manifestation is no longer visible because of the security hammering down on their presence. And when you say that the Salafis were a brotherhood, no, they were not Salafis. Mawla Sulaiman and his father, late Sultan Muhammad Abdullah, wanted to fight for the extinction of Sufism because of their political opposition. And that's why I tried to employ or use or utilize the Wahhabi movement against the Sufism. Al-Tayyib bin Qiran and other notable scholars of Morocco, they wrote so much in order to rebut the Wahhabi creed and the Wahhabi ideology, and the attempt to penetrate or this infiltration of Wahhabi ideology failed. And as you said, Usama, you said 500 Hijri, i.e. 1200 AD. For 1200 AD until the 21st century, we are still talking about the same thing. This is enough for a historical context. I know the Murabitin and the Adarisa states in Morocco were never Ash'ara. They were, yes, but ever since Bint Tumart came to power, and introduced Al-Ash'ariyya creed or faith, followed by the Marini state and the Sufism of Al-Junayd al-Salik. Ever since the 12th century or 13th century, this historical track and path was established as I described. Now I give the floor to Mr. Mubarak. Thank you. It seems that all observations were not pertinent to the Kuwaiti experience. However, I do agree with Dr. Hiba on the issue that Salafi as a phenomenon is an issue that's quite complex, even in Kuwait. And Salafism in Kuwait has become a gold mine for research work. And I call upon those who have interest to study in further detail the Salafi composition in Kuwait with its multifaceted attitudes, trends, and discourses. So thank you on that note, Dr. Hiba. And you made reference to the late Hussam Tammam's study about the rendering a countryside version of brotherhood, because my thesis is also about the impact of the brotherhood on the tribes and vice versa. In Kuwait, yes, certain political components were tribalized, either in their political arms or in their student movement arms. I cannot disentangle the issue, and there is no time now to go into further details. So thank you, Dr. Hab, on that note. Sheikh Osama said something that is really important, and I want to comment on his comment. I can understand well why Sheikh Osama said what he said. And I'm more than sure that he has ties with certain names or figures, key figures, prominent figures in the Salafi movements in Kuwait. And I believe that his relationship with the overall original Salafi movement established back in 1981 is still there. He talked about the issue in Bahrain, but how is that related to what I wrote in my paper? I was not in the business of comparing the Salafi experience in Kuwait to that in Bahrain. I know that there is a quite an effective Salafi faction that is quite influential and represented in the parliament in Bahrain. But I did not talk about that. I was talking about, particularly about the Salafi Kuwaiti experience. And I did not compare it to other. Yes, each country has its particularity. Bahrain likewise. Kuwait likewise. It has its own particularity. That's why I compared and contrasted certain Salafi factions. He talked about Salafis in Sudan and Bahrain. Yeah, that's true. But I was not in the business of following the Western scholarly methodology mode in introducing those classifications. I'm actually against some of those classifications by the Western researchers. At the end of the paper, if you read it, of my paper, if you read it, I said the use of the conventional classical activism Salafis is no longer convenient to understand. We have an opposition faction and we have a loyalist faction. Loyalist to the government. Why? I explain and what happened and why are there opposition and the reasons thereof. But all of this is within the framework of the welfare state in Kuwait. Kuwait is a welfare state. It controls the salaries, the overall wealth of the national wealth of the state. And that's why most Sunni political Islamic movements, including Salafis, excluding, but of course, Al-Ummah Party, who is outside the parliament, all of them, they interact within this framework of the welfare state. That's why it's a particularity for the Salafi faction. But I was not in the business of comparing the Kuwaiti case with the Bahraini case. This is an issue of importance and significance here. And yet again, what is wrong with using or citing some Western studies in addressing the Salafi movement in Kuwait? I see no harm in that, but I don't adopt what they say, of course, and I don't adopt whatsoever and of course, because they were ahead of us in the methodology, research methodology, scholarly methodology, etc. Be it to the structure of the regime, the change, etc. So So if they were talking about the Kuwait Islamic political movement in Kuwait, it's their concern. They want to study. We can criticize their studies, but I can never undermine the importance of the theoretical, methodological aspect of understanding these movements in Kuwait and the Arab world. We conclude with Dr. Hassan. What do you think about what has been said? And the comments on the criticisms dealt at your study. Hassan, please, before you go, you have to finish in 2 minutes because our IT guys, they have another session. Okay. Thank you, everyone. First of all, we have to realize that the Salafi phenomenon was not well studied, either in the East or in the West. So the approaches are numerous, and we can entertain them. But I wanted to present that theoretical preamble to understand Salafi movement as a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon related to Ahmad ibn Hanbal, in particular and Ibn Taymiyyah, of course, and Sayyid Qutb and the Wahhabism, of course, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab. And all of those movements are Salafis. No one is saying they're not. No one is contending that. And that's why it is complicated. Even Wahhabi Salafi is quite complicated. You have within them, you have the Salafis that is restricted to Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Muhammad ibn Wahhab, and then you have Sa'd ibn Atiq faction, and then you have those who are influenced by Jihim and the former Salafi jihadist figure. And then you have the Islamic awakening faction. So it's quite a compounded and complicated phenomenon. So yes, in order to understand, we say the puritanical form of Salafi movement, the Puritan and the Madkhaliya or Albaniya, as the Burman said, and we have the political Salafism who are preoccupied with political considerations. And of course, we have the Jihadi Salafi, which has its own dichotomous structure as well. So if they all, in their conventional discourse thesis about the book and the Sunnah, the Holy Quran and the Sunnah and the Hadith and their influence on the life of man overall, and what differentiates the thoughts and the ideology of Allal al-Fasi, al-Alusi, Muhammad Rashid Rida? Well, the thing that makes the difference is the context, or the incarnated interpretations or exegeses, is that we reinterpret those holy scripts in one way or another as per the context. So the context pushes one way or another. Most of the participants, including myself, we're all Salafis. We were pro-Albani Salafis, and then we issued Al-Anbar periodical. We were all discussing and arguing about late Sheikh Nasser's thought and ideology. So they have to stay within the line of argument. But of course, the context is important, because Muhammad Abdul Wahhab's exegesis and personal interpretation is most definitely not 100% replica of Ibn Taymiyyah's interpretation. Ibn Arabi becomes a standalone case, and then you have swarms of people following that person. And the same should apply for Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Alusi, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, or Muhammad Rashid Rida. The personal, therefore the agency effect, the active effect is important within the context. And this could produce someone like Albani, who would become influential in many people in his turn. So the relationship between the context and the text or the script produces those versions of Salafism that we have to vet more, to read and understand, and to anticipate their behavior or conduct in the future, and to wonder about their fate/destiny. Thank you. We'd like to conclude by commending everyone and say that Salafi is a group of Salafis, and it's held captor of its own word or rubric or nomenclature. Salafism is an obscure term that could take you to different references, multiple references. We're trying to approach identifying the phenomenon, and obviously it's more complicated than previously considered, needs further analysis. And on that note, I would like to resign my office of my symbolic authority position you gave me as a moderator. Back to Muhammad. Thank you very much. We're out of time. Hebe's remark would be taken into consideration with regards to pooling resources and research work, and this is part of our methodological and research concern. Thank you very much, because the IT guys, they have a next seminar on Zoom. See you next time, inshallah. مع السلامة.
شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا لكم.
دكتور
شكرا.
صلاح.
شكرا للجميع.
شكرا، كل سنة وانتم طيبين.
طيب يا هشام، ربنا يكرمك.
سلام. ايش بيس